First, my thanks to Professor Fussi for a kind invitation, and of course to our distinguished president for organizing this very nice COMET session. So my presentation deals with reverse or inverse phonation and singing, physiological, acoustical, and artistic aspects. Now, what do I mean with inverse phonation? Well, inhaling phonation is related to voice production during air inspiration inflow into the lungs. It's also called in the literature inspiratory phonation, or reverse phonation, or inverted phonation, or ingressive phonation. Phonation, but of course also singing. The physiological mechanism of inspiratory voicing can also be used for singing, and then it's called inhaling singing, with specific, as we will see, technical, artistic, and musicological aspects. Now, in humans, the first phonation is always inspiratory. That's the bird cry. And of course, at that moment, air goes into the lungs and makes the vocal fold vibrate for the first time. But beside bird cry, inspiratory phonation occurs naturally in different situations, including laughing, crying, and sighing. The first report we can find, at least I could find in the literature about inspiratory phonation, was by Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont, actually the son of John Baptist van Helmont, the famous physiologist. And he wrote about that in a treatise about pronunciation of Jewish language. In the 18th century, we can find in an ancient book by David Krantz, History of Groenland, he writes that especially women, when they affirm, that means people of Greenland, they affirm something with pleasure, they suck the air down the throat with a specific kind of sound. Wenn Sie zum Beispiel etwas mit Wohlgefallen bejahen, schlürfen Sie die Luft durch die Kehle hinunter mit einem gewissen Laut. So that's a clear description of inhaling phonation. More recently, Robert Eklund devoted a special issue of the Journal of the International Phonetic Association to ingressive phonation and speech. But of course, this was mainly an ethnological study. Pulmonic ingressive phonation, especially the ethnologic aspects. And if we summarize what Eklund found, Eklund states that transitional ingressive phonation has been used for hundreds of years as a deliberate means of speech or sound production to achieve specific effects, and is, for instance, used by shamans and ventriloquists. But also in normal spoken and spontaneous conversation, ingressive speech is found in all continents and all languages, usually with paralinguistic functions, such as feedback marker in a dialogue. Also in animals, ingressive phonation is quite frequent, and we can observe that in frogs, in horses, monkeys, donkeys, and Charles Darwin was very interested in that kind of phonation. No more to our direct field of interest, Mara Bellau and Paulo Pontes consider inspiratory phonation as a good exercise to loosen supraglottic constriction. It should tend to relax the larynx and to open the pharynx and the laryngeal inlet. And indeed, inspiratory phonation has been reported also by radiologists as a possible maneuver for improving contrast visualization of the endolarynx. Perhaps some of yours remember the time when there was not yet computer tomography or MRI, And when we asked for a good image of the larynx to the radiologist, what he usually did is using contrast product and asking the patient to make an inhaling phonation in order to get a good spreading of the contrast product inside the larynx. In clinical medicine, clinical laryngology, Koller has recommended reverse phonation to improve, in some conditions, the vision of the larynx in indirect laryngoscopy. For instance, when an endolarynx, especially the ventral commissure, is difficult to visualize, well, try it with inspiratory phonation. Sometimes it can show you more than what you see in spontaneous phonation. Now, habitual, that means permanent, reverse phonation has also been reported as a pathological entity, of course, rare, but in a particular psychodysfunctional context. That means people who have a normal larynx habitually phonate with reverse phonation. In therapy, especially speech therapy, inspiratory speech has also been suggested for treating psychogenic aphonia or mutational dysphonia, or even ventricular dysphonia and spasmodic dysphonia, also for unilateral vocal fold paralysis, and even severe stuttering. Because, of course, it changes totally the proprioception of sound production. Now to music. Well, also contemporary composers used inspiratory phonation and singing for their musical productions. For instance, Helmut Lachenmann, a well-known contemporary composer, known since the 80s, is, if I remember well, born in 1935, but still alive. He wrote in 1968 a work called Thema for flute, voice, mezzo-soprano, and cello. It's published by Breitkopf, and in this score you have passages with inspiratory phonations. They are indicated here, and this sign indicates that the singer has to shift again to normal expiratory phonation. Another composer, modern composer, Nicolas de Maison, wrote even a whole opera called Ursularia, wherein frequently inspiratory voice is used, and as you can see, I see the arrow doesn't appear on the screen, but in the red bullets you see the indication for inspiratory phonation that's frequently used for getting special effects in that opera. Also more known to the scientific world, there has been a DMA, a Doctor of Musical Arts doctorate, by Amanda de Boer, US researcher, who made a dissertation on ingressive phonation in contemporary vocal music. That's 2012. And this picture comes from Amanda de Boer's dissertation. You see that in trained vocalists, it's very well possible to make arpeggios. You see it on the spectrogram. As well in inverse as in normal phonation. You can also, with inverse singing, make glissando, a spectrogram through the whole range, and you see it's very regular, so trained vocalists can do many things with this type of voicing. Here you have a staccato with an increasing and then decreasing intensity. It's a kind of messa di voce, but with interruptions and staccato. But you see, in trained vocalists, there are a lot of possibilities, after training, of course, with ingressive phonation. Now let's come to the physiology of ingressive singing or phonation. Well, in 1999, there is a paper published in Journal of Voice by Kelly and Fisher, showing that vocal fold contact is decreased relative to normal phonation, thus decreased when the subject makes inspiratory phonation, thus less vocal fold contact. This is confirmed few years later by Orlikov, Bacon, and Krauss, who do study with EGG, electroglottography. And you see here they use the criterion of 25% baseline as reference, and you see that the duration of the closing part of the EGG is longer in expiratory phonation left than in inspiratory phonation right. And this as well in females as in males. So this confirms less vocal fold contact in inspiratory voice. Now, we ourselves were interested in this type of voicing when having met this special singer, Françoise Van Ecken, Belgian professional soprano, educated as a classical singer and singing the classical repertoire, but she got also interested and very skillful in inhaling voice. You can visit her website, there you can hear these examples. She became an international renowned singer, inhaling singer. And she agreed to participate in our research. And so we had the opportunity to exhaustively examine her with a high-speed camera and registering the sound. So we made all recordings in one single session, 4 hours, in order to have equal conditions as far as possible. And we asked the subject to sustain tones on an open vowel, at least what she could produce with the endoscope in the mouth and pharynx, but always in a comfortable way, with, of course, a rigid endoscope. This endoscope, of course, hinders to some extent the pronunciation, but for making sustained vowels, it's not a problem. So we asked her to make all kinds of emissions, low, high, soft, loud, except extreme possibilities. The really highest or low sound, that's not possible with a rigid endoscope in your mouth, so that was excluded, but we had the chance to explore a wide range of loudnesses and intensities. Now, what did we record? Well, we used video chemography. I think this method is well known to most of yours. Just to remember, it's actually a single line scan. That means that within the laryngoscopic picture on the left, you select the program, the informatic, selects one single line and reproduces that line separately from top to bottom at a rate of 7,800 lines per second. That means that for each cycle, if you phonate at 200 hertz, you have 39 lines. So you have a quite detailed vision of each separate cycle. And you can compute a lot of things on these pictures. You scan, of course, a period, but also the open time and the closed time, the opening time, the closing time, and of course the ratio of closing and opening and the amplitude. So you can measure a lot of things on these chemograms. Now, in these 4 hours, we collected, of course, several hundreds of segments, and we selected, of course, the best, because not all were of sufficient quality to make a good analysis, so we had finally 112. And out of these 112, we had, because we had asked the singer to alternate serious inspiratory and serious expiratory phonation, so we had 51 segments inspiratory and 61 expiratory of good quality on which we could make a lot of measurements. The acoustic analysis was done using 2 different programs, Praat and BioVoice, developed by our distinguished colleague, Professor Manfredi, in Florence. Especially this BioVoice for investigating the formant locations, jitter, and the amount of noise in the signal, thus voice quality parameters. Here you see an example of a video chemogram in normal phonation, that means expiratory. It's picture is well known. You see the opening, the closing, and a little shadow at the closing. The time is from top to bottom, a little shadow at the closing, showing the mucosal wave. Here you have inverted phonation, and you see it's a mirror image. Here the shadow is on the upper side, but you see also an opening and a closing and a closed phase. You see already that the closed phase is very short. We'll come back on that. Now, in order to be sure that we compare comparable things, we checked for all frequencies, and you see in the inspiratory samples and the expiratory samples, we have a comparable range of frequencies, and you see that goes from 160 to about 400 hertz. So the normal range of this singer. Also for intensity, there was no difference between the inspiratory and the expiratory conditions, so everything is comparable from that point of view. If now we look at the closed quotient, that means the duration of the closed phase relative to the period. The time the vocal folds are closed during one cycle. And here we see an important difference, very highly significant. In inspiratory, the duration of the closed phase is reduced. And that's in full agreement with what the first researchers observed in stroboscopy. Remember the paper I cited first. And also to the findings of Bacon and Orlikov with EGG, electroglottography. But we can tell a little bit more, because if we compute the relation of opening to closing, if they are equal, that means that the quotient is 1. Well, we observe that in expiratory phonation, the quotient is less than 1. That means that the closing duration is longer than the opening duration, while in inspiratory phonation, it's the contrary. That means that the opening is longer than the closing. Here you see an example, enlarged, of course. In inspiratory, the opening is a little bit longer than the closing, while in expiratory, the closing is a little bit longer than the opening. Of course, closed phase is known in normal phonation, expiratory, to be related to the loudness. The louder you phonate, the more closed phase you have. That's, of course, known since 40 years, but we see that in inspiratory phonation, the relation is maintained. It's, of course, a weak correlation, but significant, and also this closed phase, all too shorter than in expiratory phonation, increases with intensity. The maximal amplitude, maximal excursion of the vocal folds laterally is also a little bit higher in inspiratory phonation, and that's of course logic. If you know that there is less closing, you expect a little bit more amplitude. If we look at the damping of the oscillation, that means what occurs at the end of phonation, at the end of the sustained A. And you see there are, after the last contact, a few free oscillations. So we compare this also in expiratory and inspiratory phonation, and you see that the slopes are very comparable, and also statistically there is no difference. Now to voice quality. Of course, this person, this singer, has a normal voice. That means that in normal expiratory voicing you have a jitter percent less than 1, here about 0.6. In inspiratory phonation, it's a little bit more, but still less than 1, and with no significant difference from the expiratory condition. That means that voice quality, as to periodicity aspects, is approximately equal. Although we have sometimes, in inspiratory phonation, some irregularities. From time to time, you see one short moment with a few irregular cycles. If now we look at the amount of noise, adaptive normalized noise energy as defined by Professor Manfredi and computed by her system, here we find a difference. There is a little bit more noise in inspiratory than in expiratory. And that's again to be expected when we know that the closure of the vocal folds is a little bit less in inspiratory phonation. But you see the difference is not very important. If we look at harmonics, you see the number of harmonics as x-axis. Well, you see that from the sixth harmonic on, there is a difference. That means that there is more energy in the expiratory phonation than in the inspiratory phonation. Again, that's to be expected, because the energy in the higher harmonics depends on the duration of the closed phase. So if you have more closed phase in phonation, you have higher energy in the harmonics. So that's, of course, here again significant. So the main differences between in and expiratory phonation are, first, inversion, of course, of the mucosal wave. You remember the shadow. Lower closed quotient in inspiratory condition. A higher opening to closing quotient in inspiratory phonation. That means in inspiratory, opening is slower than closing, and in expiratory, opening is faster than closing, and higher values of adaptive normalized noise energy, a little bit more noise in inspiratory. Now, if we have a look at the vocal possibilities, voice phonetograms, vocal voice profile, that study was done by my colleague Moorman. Well, you see it's comparable, but there are a few less tones in the lower part. However, that's not interesting for a soprano. A soprano is interested mainly in the highest part. And there you see this subject, professional soprano, was able to gain 3 semitones in the highest part of her tessitura. And of course, that interests very much a soprano. And you see it goes from C to a D sharp, so 3 semitones more with inspiratory voicing than with expiratory voicing. Mieke Moorman did also an investigation of articulation with head of MRI, of course in a supine position. That could be influence the style of phonation. Roughly, we can see that in inspiratory phonation there is less mouth opening. There is a reduced anterior-posterior tongue dimension. There is an enlarging of the laryngeal inlet by positive pressure in inspiratory phonation. And there is a narrowing of the trachea, of course, due to the negative pressure in the trachea for making the inhaling mechanism possible. So smaller mouth opening, narrowing of subglottic region, larger supralaryngeal inlet, and smaller ventral-dorsal tongue dimension. But of course, again, these differences are quite limited. But have, of course, some repercussion on the formants, especially on the third and the fourth formant. But it's difficult to hear because the first formants, they remain stable. So let's conclude. The basic physiological mechanisms in inspirating and in expirating voice are very similar, but with a small amount of differences I have explained. But roughly, it's the same. And these small differences are probably related to the anatomy of the larynx. Obviously, the vocal fold anatomy shows that they are made for vibrating with expiratory air and not with inspiratory, as is shown by the triangular shape of the vocal fold section. So, inspiratory phonation or inhaling singing is to be considered as what musicologists call an extended vocal technique. That's a term applied to vocalization in art music, which falls outside of traditional classical singing styles, but with remarkable possibilities in skilled vocalists. And of course, it's up to the artist to use these possibilities for expressing emotions. Thank you for your attention.